glad to be able to introduce our next speaker. The next topic is really providing a natural integrative medical perspective. Our next speaker, Dr. Jennifer Stagg, is a naturopathic physician from Connecticut and has been a real thought leader, particularly in the area of epigenetics, and is the author of a book that's been out for about a year, a little over a year, called Unzip Your Genes. And it provides a health perspective and a personalized nutrition approach to patient care. But tying in a lot of what we talked about and listened to during the course of today is Dr. Jennifer Stagg.
Thank you. Thanks, John. All right. So for those of you who maybe never saw me speak before, I'm a naturopathic doctor, graduated from Bastyr University in Seattle, and my husband, who is a chiropractor, and I founded a clinic in Avon, Connecticut, called Whole Health Wellness Center, and we have an integrative approach to healthcare. So we have naturopathic physicians, chiropractic, acupuncture, and women's health. And so the core of what we do is definitely focused on nutrition. So this presentation comes through that lens of thinking about nutrition as a foundation of health. So I'm going to talk about some of these major concepts of inflammation, oxidative stress, how that ties in with epigenetics, touch a little bit on stress. We just heard an excellent lecture about stress, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about stress. But I'll also touch on microRNA as well. So when we think about inflammation, we also want to continue to think about the relationship with oxidative stress. These two processes are thought to be interdependent. And so just as you just heard, inflammation is not on its own a bad thing. It's chronic inflammation that is an issue. Same thing comes when we think about oxidative stress. As the release of reactive oxygen species are necessary for phagocytosis. So we need these reactive oxygen species in order for phagocytes to kill bacteria, for the whole process of apoptosis. So again, I really do want to point out that oxidative stress on its own is not necessarily a bad thing. It's excessive oxidation, same concept as inflammation. So when we think about inflammation, the main player we think about is NF-kappa B. So again, this is another case where you've probably read studies, seen a lot of literature about NF-kappa B and NF-kappa B being a target of various phytonutrients that we know this works for the NF-kappa B pathway. Oxidants like hydrogen peroxide activate NF-kappa B. And then conversely, antioxidants block NF-kappa B. So then NF-kappa B also gets this label of, being certainly a negative player, just like we think when we hear inflammation, we hear oxidative stress. Now we think NF-kappa B is bad as well. But NF-kappa B, again, complex role. It will contribute to some of the gene clusters that are necessary to resolve inflammation and relieve oxidative stress. So always kind of come back that we're thinking more about balance, right? And as a whole, when we think about that patient in front of you, presenting in front of you, mostly what we're seeing the results of is imbalance when it comes to homeostasis for the most part. But then our complex role is trying to figure out and target where the dysfunction is, how far back can you go to basically intervene and have some significant outcome that you'll see in terms of their health trajectory. So that's where for me, the first thing I start thinking about is nutrition. So when I think about the nutrition and assess the nutritional status of my patients, and I treat a wide variety of patients, children, geriatric patients, most of my patients are adults, but then I'm looking at the balance of their macronutrients. Are they getting excessive amounts of calories? But then what do those calories consist of? How much of those calories are coming from colorful plants in their diet? And this is important because when we start to think about a mechanistic approach, oxidative stress, then these plant compounds contain these bioactive constituents that protect DNA, that act as direct antioxidants, can scavenge free radicals. And then we start to think about upregulation of the endogenous antioxidant systems. And certainly the effects on enzymes. So that's a complex cascade of processes that occur just with that whole concept of food as medicine, right? So at its core, food is medicine, and we need to always step back and think about, well, what incoming signals is that patient getting from a dietary perspective? So some of the phytochemicals, when we think about some of the foods our patients are eating, when they're consuming green tea, when they're eating broccoli and leafy greens, if they're eating beets, if they're consuming turmeric, these compounds like curcumin in turmeric or sulforaphane in broccoli, all of these compounds affect the oxidative status of your patient. So then the other, I mentioned NF-kappa B being involved in inflammation. So when it comes to the antioxidant network, then the factor that you'll see a lot of papers about is NRF2. And so you'll see various different phytonutrients singled out as being able to regulate or upregulate NRF2. And this is basically the regulator of the antioxidant response element. So when I think about antioxidant pathways, broccoli extract certainly comes to mind. So broccoli extract has specific components, the sulforaphane, that can activate that NRF2 pathway, that antioxidant response element. And so when we think about oxidative stress, then that relates to inflammation then as well, and certainly outcomes that you'll see phenotypically in your patient. So we're always trying to think about that balance between tissue function, impairment, inflammation, oxidative stress, and making sure there's enough incoming antioxidants from the diet to counterbalance the free radicals. And so not only, then you have to think about where are these free radicals coming from. Environmental pollutants are also an issue. So when you're assessing a patient's diet, yes, it may be full of colorful vegetables, but are those vegetables and fruits containing like persistent environmental pollutants, organophosphates, pesticides as well, which then can put stress on the oxidative pathways. So that broccoli extract, being an NRF2 inducer, as I said, leads to inactivating free radicals through that antioxidant response pathway, but it also directly can block the NF-kappa B. So these two pathways are tightly regulated, and that's why when you're thinking about your patients and you're thinking about inflammation, you always need to think about oxidative stress as well. Those two come hand in hand, and I feel like, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago, there was a lot of focus on antioxidants, and those basically, were capturing a lot of people's attention. We, recommended high-dose antioxidants for patients, and then we were led down the road to the importance of inflammation, which the two are, it turns out, yes, that's important as well. But I'm emphasizing not to forget the oxidative stress pathways, because you really need to be focusing on both to make sure that they're balanced. So with beet leaf phenolics, this particular slide, why I included it, is to just point out that the compounds, when we think about like, well, what are you eating? You're eating Swiss chard, you're eating leafy vegetables, what is that doing? That has the ability to directly scavenge free radicals. And this particular slide shows the total phenolic compounds content and the ability to inhibit free radicals. So what is concerning, though, when I see, and certainly a lot of the patients that come to us are actually eating a lot healthier diets than the majority of the American population, but this type of statistic is quite alarming that 90% of the population doesn't even meet the recommended daily vegetable intake. And so this particular slide shows the difference according to age, and the bars on your left hand on the green side showing how many are below the percentage recommendation. So summarizing, the vast majority of the population is not getting to that just like basic level of intake with vegetables. And why that matters, even only one serving actually matters. So this slide shows that for each serving of vegetables added, so starting out on the far left of that slide, with the addition of one serving of vegetables, there's a 5% risk reduction in all-cause mortality. And so for each serving of vegetables added, there's an additional 5% risk reduction, and that bottoms out or plateaus at about 5 servings. That doesn't mean you tell your patients there's no sense in eating beyond 5 servings of vegetables, but it is a really important point that just getting your patient to start to eat a couple more servings of vegetables a day actually does make a difference to their long-term health trajectory. And so even when I'm working with a patient who is a child, for example, and they come in and their diet, and many of you have had patients like this in their practice, that really they're eating maybe a serving of vegetables a day, maybe, and it's like carrots, or they're eating an applesauce or something like that. And just starting to change their balance. So a lot of times what I'll recommend, because kids are, they've got a sensitive palate and they're difficult to work with when it comes to adding nutrition, what I'll do is I'll have them start by like their afternoon snack, for example, which a lot of times it just looks like a series of, different flour products that they're eating throughout the day. So for their afternoon snack, I'll have the parent then, slice up half an apple and have them eat that first, and then give them half the serving size of whatever snack that they were eating before, to help them to start to incorporate more nutrition into their diet. And this is basically, this is what we're dealing with when we look at kids and how much fruit, and this particular slide looks at fruit consumed on a given day. So in this instance, the bars indicate the age of the child. So on the far left, you'll see that most kids are consuming, some fruit on a given day. But what types of fruits are they consuming? So as you kind of go across there towards the right, you start to see fruit juice is included on this chart. So a lot of times what you're seeing is that kids are eating fruit as categorized by the CDC, but a lot of it is coming from fruit juice. And as they get older, a lot of times they're not, you can see they're not drinking as much fruit juice anymore, but unfortunately the reality is a lot of them are now drinking soda, and that's their replacement. And so you can see their fruit intake is coming down on that slide as they get older. And then the same is true of vegetables, basically. So you see a lot of kids are eating vegetables. Those numbers look encouraging, that are just consuming. And this statistic is like, are they eating any vegetables at all on a given day? So you see, those numbers are up over 90 for all age groups. But when you start to break that down a little bit further, what are those vegetables? And we know like dark green leafy vegetables are the are going to be really concentrated in those phytonutrients that we know affect the antioxidant pathways and impact inflammation as well. Well, you can see those numbers are startlingly low, down around 10% for most kids there, a little higher in the younger kids where the parents have more control of the diet is how I would think about that. But what you're seeing there also, red and orange, ketchup is included as a vegetable, unfortunately, and like pasta sauce, and then starchy vegetables, so French fries are considered a vegetable as well. So it's really discouraging to like think about childhood as a very sensitive period of development. There was mention of adverse childhood experiences, traumatic, psychological trauma, physical trauma. I would lot dietary trauma in that category as well, because we know that it does matter what you're eating, and there are very sensitive periods of time for brain and overall development. I'm going to single out blueberries, basically. So anthocyanins are found to be quite high in blueberries, and this particular study published back in 2017 was looking at the effects of a blueberry extract on mood in children and young adults, and they actually did find that there were improvements in executive function for rumination. So a lot of times, even in my teenage girls who were coming in, which I would say I'm seeing like an epidemic of anxiety in teenage girls, one of the things that I have them do, and a lot of it is just like at the end of the day, they're ruminating on things that are upsetting them, things that have happened during the day, having difficulty letting go of stress related to school. So this particular process called rumination, blueberry extract or blueberry juice even, I have girls drinking to help improve that particular outcome. And we know what are these anthocyanins doing? They're scavenging free radicals. There's a complex series of mechanisms going on here, but also, of course, you have antioxidant capacity, but also inflammatory pathways through the cyclooxygenase pathway and cytokine signaling as well. Another study looking at blueberries and cognition in children aged 7 to 10, and these kids were given wild freeze-dried blueberry extract and in the morning, and then they were basically tested on a lot of measures, 1 hour, 3 and 6 hours later. And across basically all those measures, there were significant improvements in their memory, their word recognition. So we think about, now you start to think about how this affects academic performance as well. So even an hour out, you were seeing changes in their ability, cognitive ability and performance, which I think is really important to see and exciting to see. So one thing that I often recommend is like if you're for breakfast, including blueberries or some of these dark berries, phytonutrients in a smoothie in the morning. So like for my kids, their morning smoothie does contain wild frozen blueberries. So back to inflammation. I'm not sure if earlier in the morning there was any slides about the initiation phase versus resolution phase, but I just wanted to point out that with chronic inflammation, and this does tie in even to the endocannabinoid system, and I think I have a couple of slides on that as well. With chronic inflammation, what's happening is not a failure of the initiation phase to end, it's more so a failure to resolve inflammation. So there's this switching between the phagocyte activity with the neutrophils, and that initiation, that acute response, which we know is necessary. This is the hallmark of inflammation is necessary, and then that switching, the monocytes take over, and that's also an active phase called the resolution pathway. And endocannabinoids are involved in that. Omega-3s are involved in that pathway. And this next slide shows the balance between omega-6s and omega-3s. So omega-3s end up going through a series of conversion steps to these pro-resolving mediators, resolvins, protectants. So once you consume the omega-3s, they get converted in your body to these pro-resolving mediators that help us basically shut down that inflammatory pathway and kind of like turn off that inflammation. So in hemp oil, the components in hemp oil itself, it does contain omega-3s. And some of these omega-3s go down that same pathway and can contribute to resolution pathway as well. So when your patient is under a lot of both inflammation, oxidative stress, when they're under physical or psychological stress, their propensity for genetic predisposition, which there are SNPs involved in inflammation, there are SNPs involved in the antioxidant pathways. Their propensity to have problems, or I often explain it to patients of like these systems, you're having a block in those systems. A lot of that is the result of these particular SNPs that become basically turned on. So that concept of epigenetics, of genes being able to get turned on and turned off. So when I'm assessing a patient and I'm pretty certain inflammation is an underlying cause of some of the conditions that they're presenting with, then I start to look at the various parts of their presentation that would contribute to that. And so it's usually not, it's not simple. Most of the patients that are coming in, they're listing 5 or 6 different diagnoses of disease conditions. And then layered on top of that, various subjective complaints and early signs of additional dysfunction. So you really need to look at all of these particular pathways and think about what parts of it are contributing to this patient's clinical presentation. So this is certainly, there's a lot on here that are related to diet, food sensitivities, oxidative stress as a result of poor diet. I mentioned before nutrient deficits, nutrient excess as well. Just the fact of having additional visceral fat and adiposity in the midsection is a cause of chronic inflammation in itself, and certainly the resulting insulin resistance contributes to that as well. And then the whole environmental pollutants, leaky gut, endotoxins in the gut, dysbiosis, it gets really complex quickly. So a lot of times it's hard to figure out where to start. And you will get those patients who come in and they are seemingly doing everything right. So they're eating a healthy diet, they're following a great exercise program, they're already on supplements, they're getting all their foundational pieces in place. But then a question, a lot of times what I will identify is like, well, what's the elephant in the room? It's often stress. And so you saw this slide earlier. You have like existing psychological stress that the patients are dealing with, and that results in turning on these pro-inflammatory genes. And so although the diet looks anti-inflammatory, and you wonder how could this patient be inflamed, this patient is a healthy weight. So if you looked at that list over there, you would say, well, okay, and you've done a GI assessment, and maybe their bacteria looks fine. What you need to definitely take a close look at is what their stress response system looks like. And that can be a cause of chronic inflammation as well. And if they're not dealing with current stress, as we just heard, early life stress can impact these systems as well. So you can have long-lasting effects from stress that's happened in the past, unfortunately. This showed up in, I can't remember where this ended up showing up, but this was kind of a headline in the popular media. outlining a study that had recently been published showing that babies who basically were held had their genetics changed for many years as a result of that. And we know we've seen many studies related to that, studies of children in orphanages and smaller brain size, even in kids who did not have that close comforting earlier in life. So we did learn a lot about stress and the stress response system. I want to go back a little bit more to whole foods nutrition. So when we think about nutrition, when I'm thinking about that with patients, and I'm doing nutritional counseling, and I'm talking to them about getting enough servings of fruits and vegetables in their diet, I also am recommending that they eat a lot of different types of fruits and vegetables, but also even herbs and spices, that the diversity seems to be very critical. So I don't think I have a slide in here, but this concept of plant diversity is really critical, not only for expression of our human genes, for the epigenetics there, but also for expression of the genes in our microbiome. So there are some studies looking at diversity of intake of plants and improved diversity basically in the gut bacteria. And so what it's looking like is that it's more important to have, that you could have a little less like total vegetable content, for example. So say a patient consumed 5 servings of vegetables, but they came from 2 or 3 main sources, versus someone who consumed 4 servings of vegetables, but they've got like 20 different foods that they're coming from. That is impacting our human genes, and especially the gut bacteria, the genes in our microbiome. And this comes back to the concept of plant synergy. So synergy essentially means that the effect, if you have an effect from plant A and an effect from plant B, when you add them together, you don't get 1 + 1, you end up, so you don't end up with 2, you end up with 3, basically, to put it in a more simplified term. And this goes back to the importance that we heard this morning about using something like a whole hemp plant extract. The number of compounds in there are probably also acting just as it does in the entire plant kingdom, synergistically, right? So when you start singling out one compound, as you heard this morning, you start to have more of a pharmaceutical effect, and that can have a cascade or ripple effect. And the beauty of whole plants is in that complexity, that all of those compounds are provided in nature for a reason. So some plants, you can do an analysis and they can have 1,000 different compounds in there, and we probably know a lot about what 5 or 6 of those do, and we don't necessarily know about what some of the smaller compounds do, but the understanding is that they're probably balancing out the effects of each other, so you don't end up with the adverse effects like you see when you take a synthetic or pharmaceutical. The same issue can happen when you start singling out and purifying and doing single extracts. And as I said, these particular compounds, like when we think about like colorful foods in our diet, you think about green tea, you have components like EGCG, in green vegetables you have isothiocyanate. That slide didn't turn out very great, unfortunately. But like and I even talk to the patients about this as well. When you're looking at the different colors in your diet, you're also getting a diverse amount of different phytochemicals within the plant kingdom. Here's another slide that emphasizes that as well. And so this is about the antioxidant activity of buckwheat versus just rutin alone. And so rutin is a powerful antioxidant. And up to about 20 microgram dosage, the whole plant is outperforming that single extract. So again, this shows that concept of plant synergy, which there have been countless studies on this as well. looking at the impact of things like the whole tomato plant. So when I'm treating a male patient who is coming to me for prostate health, a history of prostate cancer, I'll recommend a whole tomato paste extract as opposed to just giving them like a single supplement with lycopene in it. And then we also know about absorption, and so with that, then I'm often recommending olive oil so patients get more out of that food, basically. That story continues throughout the plant kingdom. Some dietary epigenetic modifiers as well I want to point out are foods like chocolate. So there was a Spanish study, I think this was back 2015, 2016, and this was done in humans, and they looked at chocolate consumption, and the people who were consuming chocolate in this study had a favorable pattern of hypomethylation. So this is global methylation status. So this is an epigenetic phenomenon. The people who had MTHFR and MTRR SNPs didn't display as pronounced an effect. So when we think about chocolate, we think about, okay, this is healthy for blood vessels. We think about like some of these reasons why chocolate is important, but you start to think about this as you go deeper and deeper. A lot of this comes back to epigenetics and the ability to turn on and off genes. And then the same thing, many different studies on this looking at like whole green tea extract and being able, or just green tea consumption, and that being related to being able to undo hypermethylated DNA. And then that is why there's improvement in tumor suppressor genes. And we see that in coffee. Turmeric also is a potent hypomethylation agent. So these are all, concepts that as a practitioner you want to understand. Sometimes you get those patients in your office who want a lot more detail and they're looking for information like this, but a lot of this is just helping you to better understand how powerful nutrition is, and not to discount what working with dietary counseling and making sure your patients are getting a diverse group of phytochemicals in their diet. And so we talked a little bit, we talked about that concept of epigenetics and methylation of the DNA as a whole. The other thing, what we're learning more and more about is microRNAs. So microRNAs and more of the evolving papers and research that's coming out now is starting to look at nutramyromics. And so gets even, just when you think you had a handle on epigenetics, now we go to nutramyromics. And basically, this basically is in the realm of epigenetics as well. But these microRNAs can be endogenous. So these are 18 to 25 nucleotide length compounds, RNA molecules that are produced in our body. So we think about like endocannabinoids produced in our body. We have microRNAs being produced in our body, and that can be influenced by the dietary signals as well. So the other thing, though, is that there are microRNAs in food as well. So this, again, you start to hear this similar story when we think about endocannabinoids, the endogenous cannabinoids, and then you have phytocannabinoids, which look like cannabinoids that also are cannabinoid receptors, recognize more complexity added to the equation, that some of these effects can be coming from microRNAs. You have some of these bioactive compounds impacting the endogenous expression of microRNA. So some of these phytochemicals, which we just talked about, curcumin, EGCG in green tea, quercetin, some of these proanthocyanins. So when I talked about like what blueberries are doing, So why do blueberries have that effect? They are high in flavonoids, anthocyanins, they have antioxidant capacity, but now we see that it also affects microRNA, so it goes deeper to gene expression. And even simple things like how, the vitamin status of your patients. I'm routinely, checking vitamin D levels on patients, checking various nutrients on patients, doing RBC zinc. These things really matter. They can make a profound impact on your overall health, because now we see documented that some of these vitamins and minerals impact microRNA expression as well. And so it gets very detailed when you start to look in the literature. You can see detailed which microRNA, so you'll see MER153, MER146, EGCG affecting BCL2, which has to do with apoptosis. So right away, many papers being published on that. And then you have microRNAs all over the body. So you have microRNAs in your circulation affecting cardiovascular health. These microRNAs are in your brain. They are in your spinal cord. These microRNAs are regulating healthy cellular function basically in every system of your body. And then, as I said, there are food-derived exogenous microRNAs that have been documented to be found in the intestine. So some of these microRNAs, you can measure them in the food before it's consumed. Some of these don't survive digestion, so there's a lot to be understood about microRNAs. It seems like the animal sources of microRNA have better bioavailability. So when you're thinking about PMGs, microRNAs, the animal source microRNAs have different improved bioavailability. But then, there's question about these sitting in the intestine, just like the story of turmeric and curcumin and curcuminoids. We know curcumin on its own is not absorbed very well, and there's a whole complex of curcuminoids, and some of it sits in the gut. And this is the same story of chocolate as well, is that some of the effects may be happening in the intestine itself and affecting the microbiome. And so you may not need for those compounds to be highly bioavailability to have effect on your patient's health trajectory. And then microRNAs, as I mentioned earlier, the CB1 and CB2 receptors are impacted by omega-3. So this comes back to that resolution pathway. So the microglial cells, these macrophages that go through M1, M2 class switching, are impacted by endogenous, the 2AG that we heard a lot about this morning, are affecting inflammation in that pathway, but some of that happens through a microRNA regulated process. So again, you start to see all of this coming together, and there's so much more to learn about it. And it gets, the more you read about it, the more you realize you don't know. It's really exciting to see all the papers and research interest that has been continuing to evolve on these topics to start to tie all of this together and get a better understanding of how that will impact your ability to care for patients. So I'm just going to end with a case study. So this is a patient that I had treated for years in my practice. So she's a 45-year-old female, and I hadn't seen her in a couple of years, but I had treated her for a few years for various complaints, and she did have anxiety, which had become even more severe by the time she had come back to me. So at the time she came back to me, she was it had progressed to she was having panic attacks on a regular basis. She was having trouble sleeping, and this was not the case when I had seen her, so this had gotten much more progressive. She had PMDD, and she had severe PMS, probably not in the category of PMDD when I had seen her in the past, and a very exaggerated stress response. She was also having headaches, and she was certainly complaining of, generalized chest pressure. Her primary care doctor had been seeing her, and she had ended up, they had agreed that they would start some pharmaceuticals. So at this point then she was taking sertraline, and she was taking lorazepam that was to be used, as needed, but she was finding she was taking it almost every day. And she was still symptomatic. So back she came to me. At that point, in terms of supplements, she was taking magnesium glycinate, she was taking omega-3s. In the past, for any of you who treat patients with anxiety, you're probably familiar with a lot of these different supplements. So over the years, we had tried a lot of different nutraceuticals. We had used taurine, B6. We'd used 5-HTP for her. We had done methylfolate. We had used some various herbals. And then certainly, as a naturopathic doctor, we had, worked with her diet. We had assessed her gut. Like, we'd done really everything at that point. So at that point, I was asking her to consider genomic testing to do a more thorough panel. And we had basically just done a limited amount of genomic testing in the past. And she had declined that because I said, I had introduced her the concept of using hemp oil because she had never tried that before. And so she said, well, I'd like to try that first instead of investing in genetic testing right now. Maybe, we agreed to give that a try and see how she was. So the only addition we used was a full complex of hemp oil with the additional omega-3s, and we used that hemp oil enriched with the broccoli extract. So when she had come back in 4 weeks at her office visit, she stated that she was feeling a lot better, and as I pushed her a little further to try to quantify that, she said that she seen just her overall general anxiety symptoms were reduced probably about 50%. So this was a 1 month on a 2-a-day additional hemp oil for a patient who I would almost lot her in the category of being treatment resistant. She really wasn't using much lorazepam at that point. In the week preceding the visit, I believe she hadn't used it at all. And she had had 1 menstrual cycle, I believe the week before, so I had seen her the month before. And she just said she had, this was good for her, that she only had 1 described episode of extreme irritability during the days leading up to her period. So at that point, we just, decided to just watch and wait again, because she said she was feeling a lot better. And she declined genetic testing, and we decided to just continue to treat her. And she still, when I submitted these slides, I didn't have any follow-up at that point, but she's still doing quite well on the hemp oil complex that is managing her symptoms. And so that hemp oil complex is, think about it, there's a lot of complexity in there. So when I try to think about hemp oil and why is this happening for her? Why is she having such improvement on it? There's a lot of reasons I could come up with, and so she was already on omega-3, so I don't think it was necessarily that alone, right? That doesn't necessarily make sense in her case. We know that the phytocannabinoids can bind the serotonin receptors, but she was on, we had tried 5-HTP for her. She was on a pharmaceutical that targeted serotonin receptors, and she wasn't any better. So really it came down to, that complex of effects. We know hemp oil contains terpenes, it contains flavonoids, it contains phytocannabinoids. So I think this was a case, certainly it's an N of 1 study, clinical study, but I chose this case because it was a very difficult case and it was a simple intervention. And sometimes simple interventions can really do the trick. So for her, and her predominant symptom was anxiety. That's why I selected that for her, because the amount of my own research I've done on hemp oil and the cannabinoid system, seems like patients who have anxiety would be a good target group selectively. Okay, so that ends my presentation.